All right, awesome. Well, thank you for having me today. As Carolyn mentioned, my name's Erin Griffith, and I'm the program manager for Fedora. I'm here today to talk about the newest version of Fedora, which is Fedora 6, and also talk about some of the tools and migration pathways for moving from older versions to 6.0. So I will just start by saying that the conversations that have been happening about Valkyrie and Hyrax, as it relates to Fedora, have been super intriguing over the last day and a half. I'm going to talk today specifically about Fedora to Fedora migrations. There's a little bit of information kind of that's specific to a lot of folks here, but I'm going to do my best to answer what questions I can for you. And if there's anything technically related that I cannot answer, please drop it in the Slack. I will get back to you and find out anything that I can answer today. So Fedora 6 and migration pathways, that's what I'm here to talk about. So just really briefly, for anybody that might not have a super deep understanding of exactly what Fedora does or what it is, a quick refresher for those who do know. Fedora is an open source preservation focused digital repository platform used to manage and disseminate digital content. So Fedora is used by a wide variety of institution types. We have cultural heritage organizations, scientific research centers, academic collections, libraries, and they all use Fedora to provide access to their, to store and provide access to their large and oftentimes very complex digital collections. So Fedora is designed to interoperate with other applications and services. It's not typically found as a standalone service or a standalone piece in the stack. A lot of people use it for their digital preservation needs, and then they would have a front end, for example, like Samvera and the Samvera applications, or things like Islandora, or oftentimes a custom front end to display to users. For anybody that isn't aware, last year we released the long-awaited and much-needed Fedora 6.0, which is the newest and most current version, and was a major revamp of our software. So in 6.0, as a kind of overview, we eliminated mode shape as the back end, which was in Fedora 4. And we did this, knowing that Fedora 4 and mode shape wasn't serving the community well in many ways. So mode shape was replaced with a new persistence layer, which incorporates the Oxford Common File Layout, or OCFL, as a preservation standard, which I'm going to get into in just a second. So Fedora, which is nearly into its 25th year, has been around for a little while. During this time, we've definitely seen the release of several iterations of the core software, for good and for bad. In 2008, Fedora 3 was released, and this was and still remains to be the most widely used version of the software that exists out there. And this is in large part due to the functionalities that Fedora 3 offers. So the main thing being this very transparent access to your data. But being nearly 15 years old, Fedora 3 has reached end of life and is no longer being supported by the community. So thanks to an IMLS grant funded project, the Fedora team, along with 2 pilot partners at the University of Virginia and Whitman College, we were able to create the much needed documentation and tooling to help get these users that are in instances of Fedora 3 to Fedora 6, because their content and security and access really is at risk being in Fedora 3 and it not being supported by the community. But I think most importantly here, we'll talk about, so in 2014, Fedora 4 was released, and it was at this point that the community needed to make a decision on how to modernize and update the technology and determine the direction that the software would ultimately take. So decisions were made at this juncture that had, kind of outcomes that we couldn't have predicted at that point in time. So mode shape was incorporated as a back end, and in doing so, we really lost all transparency to our data, and we locked things into systems with little to no visibility into what was happening. So, this is one of those pieces that we couldn't really foresee. Mode shape was subsequently dropped by its own community, and because of this, it really just became this black box of unknowns, which put some of our Fedora users in really tough situations. So Fedora 4 also had some speed and performance issues at scale. There was the issue of many members, which was impacting a lot of users. And this was partly based on the way that mode shape was handling the data. And then there was also the active Fedora component. So this created some additional performance issues because of the way that it was tied to Solar. And then the last piece was that migrations to Fedora 4 were massively resource intensive. We had re-architected the software, and the time that it was going to take people and the skill set that was required to have people migrate to 4 was immense. And then, having users get to 4 only to have it underperform was, a really harsh reality that the Fedora community needed to address. So all in all, Fedora 4 had this really unfortunate result, especially, as it relates to, I think, a lot of people in this community. I do just want to note that there are some people running instances of Fedora 4 that are not dissatisfied with the way it's performing. It's operating the way that they'd like it to. But I think, as an overall statement, we can say that, the community recognizes that 4 wasn't our best foot forward. So for us in Fedora, all of our actions from kind of this realization forward were directed at really creating something that was going to try to resolve as many of these issues for the community as a whole as we could. So the Fedora community came together and they really collaborated and tried to address all of the things that 4 lacked. And we came up with a solution that was going to deliver something to give everybody back all those things that people loved about Fedora 3. So that's what came out of, this unfortunate situation is Fedora 6. So between 4 and 5, we developed and released the Fedora API specification, which is another critical and key component that a lot of people are using to the best of its advantages. And, with Fedora 6, like I mentioned, this is the software that our community needs now. It was nearly 2.5 years in the making and development and testing, and we really needed to get this right for the users in all of our communities. And we feel really strongly that Fedora 6 is going to deliver what 4 couldn't. So these are some of the features that Fedora 6 has to offer. If you've heard me talk before, I often go through this list, but one of the biggest and most important ones that I want to point out here is the adoption of the Oxford Common File Layout, or OCFL, as I mentioned, as a preservation standard within the persistence layer. So OCFL technically is a specification that describes an application-independent approach to the storage of digital information in a structured, transparent, and predictable manner. So it is a specification that dictates the way that data is laid out and formatted on disk. So it's designed to promote long-term object management best practices within digital repositories. It is defined and developed by an editorial board who is responsible for the upkeep, continued development, and maintenance of the specification. So OCFL is the specification, and Fedora 6 uses a Java implementation of the specification, and that comes standard in Fedora 6. And the idea here is that OCFL is going to give you back control over your repository. So data that's in an OCL format is entirely transparent. It's written in plain text files, and the standard dictates the way that's done so that you can see everything on disk, which is something that wasn't available with ModeShape. So with this visibility and this transparency and these, human parsable files, in future, ideally, you won't need to reformat your data. And, if you needed to update hardware or software, the files remain as is, and you can just pick them up and move them elsewhere. So, less migrations, or at least less complicated migrations, is the end goal. So OCFL in the place of ModeShape also helps to tackle the speed and performance issues that we've seen, that have been identified in Fedora 4. We're still scale testing things in 6, but those who are using it really haven't encountered the same kind of types of problems that we've identified or that we've seen with past versions of 4. So that's the OCFL and the enhanced digital preservation components. Other features that we have for Fedora 3 to 6 migration specifically, there is extensive migration tooling and documentation. And this is, again, thanks to that IMLS grant that we were awarded. And this was to help lower those barriers to migration and bring these at-risk versions of Fedora to Fedora 6. There's an extensive migration toolkit that serves as a guide for executing the migration, along with templates, guides, command line tools, and all those things you need to actually execute the migration work. So we also have built-in simple search, not meant to replace something like Solr, but just a really easy kind of user interface that you can briefly browse through your repository if you need. And this was a community request when we were planning and laying out what 6 was going to look like. And another cool feature that we have is this kind of real-time performance monitoring capabilities. And this is done through an integration with Grafana and Prometheus. So you can link these up, and then you can see how your repo is operating in real time. And for us, this was really critical in the development and testing phases. Getting to 6, we were able to see what was happening quickly and understand where bottlenecks were happening so that we could dig in and fix these performance issues kind of as they were happening. And then lastly, with our newest version, 6.2, we have metrics collecting for anybody that's interested in seeing what's in your repository. It's just a really brief JSON output of, you can look at things like object count by MIME type, byte counts, really simple but helpful metrics. Again, this was another community request for a feature in 6. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we understand and we recognize that there is current work being done to replace active Fedora and with Valkyrie, and we're excited about that. And what this means kind of for the Fedora and Hyrax users. There's probably that slide that Daniel Pierce put up yesterday that everybody kind of grabbed onto and is probably circulating the communities now, outlining the Hyrax and the Valkyrie kind of progression and the future paths forward. And thank you, Alexandra Dunn, for your product update yesterday. I'm really looking forward to what's coming down the line. But again, I'm here today. I want to talk about just straight Fedora to Fedora migrations. And I want to just outline what the pathways look like from older versions to 6. So as I mentioned, if you're running a version of 3, thanks to the grant work that I was talking about, the path is really straightforward. Fedora 3 can skip right over 4 and 5 and move right to Fedora 6 using the migration utils. But I imagine, a lot of the people here today are still sitting in versions of Fedora 4. And the pathway here does involve a few more steps, but it is possible and it is doable. And I have an example to share with you in just a moment. But the first step in Fedora 4 migration is getting to, the critical step, I guess, is getting to 4.7.5, so 4.7.5. And the reason for that is that older versions of 4, once you hit 4.7.5, what's there aligns more closely with the components related to the Fedora API. Just another note here, if you're on older versions of Fedora, I want to say 4.2 or later, there is a Java 8 update that is required to get you to move ahead. And that is just something that one of the examples that I'm going to give, one of the things that they ran into. So at the end of the slide deck, also all of the migration pathways and the documentation that's related to it is included. So you can have a look through them. The documentation looks pretty clear. And from what we understand, it is pretty clear, but it's all there for you. So once you're at 4.7.5, you can then use the Fedora import-export utility to export your repository to disk. And then you will use the Fedora upgrade utility to upgrade 4.7.5 to a 5.1.1 export. And then you'll use the same utility again, make some parameter adjustments to input outputs, and you'll upgrade your 5.1.1 export to a Fedora 6 compliant OCFL. So it's going to rewrite the data and make it OCFL compliant. And then you'll be able to stand up your Fedora 6 repo and have it point to the new OCFL that you created in the previous step. So obviously, this is best case scenario. This is, steps to do it. From what we are hearing and what we know, the tools have worked so far. But really, for us, the best way to know if there's more needed or what isn't working, what is working, is for people to test and try. Sample sets, we're happy to take feedback on testing of sample sets, anything like that. But the more we know, the more support we can offer, and we can be ready for when, that Valkyrized Hyrax is ready as well. So this is just a brief outline of the tools that I just kind of mentioned to get you through those steps. So the first two, the top line there, these are for your 4 to 6 migrations. So there's the import-export tool and the upgrade utility. For the bottom line there, these are for your 3 to 6 migrations and what's available. So there's the migration utils, which is actually the command line tool that you'll use to run the migration. And then there's the migration validator tool that you can run post-migration to ensure that all your content was moved over correctly and moved into Fedora 6 the way post-migration. So this has been a really helpful tool because we've heard that the migration utils will run a checksumming as it's migrating, and this can add time to what it takes to physically migrate. So if you turn the checksumming off during migrations, you can run this validator post-migration and save yourself some time on the actual migration itself. run the validator after, and then go back and verify. So this has been super handy. And then there's the metadata remediation guide that was created. This is an exhaustive and expansive metadata package put together by the team at Whitman College as part of that IMLS grant that I was talking about. So this is that example that I said I really wanted to share today. I know that a lot of people, you like to hear who's done it, who's tried it, what's kind of happening in the community. So this was a Berlin State Library is one of the Fedora, is a Fedora community member, active and engaged over at Fedora. They migrated a Fedora 4 instance to Fedora 6 back when Fedora 6 was actually in alpha. I said I had beta originally written, but it was in an alpha release, and they opted to test the migration at that point. So the Berlin State Library had a Fedora 4.5.1 repository, and they chose to migrate to Fedora 6. So what they had was approximately 30,000 objects, roughly, I want to say just under 10 gigs, under 10, cancel that statistic, 30,000 objects we'll go with. So they were originally scanned documents that they had converted to PDF files with some XML descriptions. So they had 4.5.1, and they were using a custom Samvera front end. They did identify that 4.5.1 was working well for them, but what they really wanted to do was start looking to future-proof themselves, and they had a really big interest in what OCFL was going to offer them. So they selected this kind of smallish data set to sample and use the tools and run the process. So what they did is they needed to upgrade from 4.5.1 first to 4.6.1. And this is where they ran into that Java 8 issue that I had kind of mentioned just as a note. So they had to update to Java 8 in between there. What they did once at 4.6.1 is they created a backup of their repo here. Then they restored the backup using the upgrade utility. They restored the backup to 4.7.5, which gets them at that point that they can use, that it aligns with the API, and then they can use the rest of the tools to get forward. So at 4.7.5, they exported their repository to .ttl serialization. And Oliver can explain, Oliver Schoner is the individual who worked on the migration. He can explain better about their intentions and their purposes of exporting to the TTL serialization. But what they did with that, once they had it exported there, is they were able to then use the upgrade utility to get them to 5.5.1, and then the last step, upgrade to Fedora 6. So then they had the OCFL compliant pieces, and their data was all laid out in the way that they wanted it. So the feedback from their experience through this migration was that the tooling worked. They did encounter a few bugs in the alpha release of the tooling, but they were able to identify that, use the community to resolve those issues for future, for going forward, and they really wanted to kind of hammer home the fact that the community was what was instrumental in helping them get to 6, answering questions in the Slack channel, coming to the tech meetings, et cetera, et cetera. This is how we've tried to be responsive to those that are in this migration situation. Is we really need to hear that you're trying it, hear that you're doing it, so that we can step in and intervene, because we don't know what's not working until people are trying it. So, they were really thankful that the committer team was there to help them resolve what they ran into. That in terms of the migration, Oliver will tell you that it really wasn't necessarily the Fedora migration that was the most challenging. There were all the little small components along the way. He did recognize, it's a multi-step process. It's not a straight 3 to 6. Being at 4 means you do have to take those interim steps, but managing them in kind of like chunk portions and tackling them one step at a time was the way that they were able to get through it. So currently their migrated repository is using Fedora 6, still with active Fedora and a Samvera custom front end. They don't have any plans to remove active Fedora once Valkyrie is fixed on that particular repository. They're happy with the way it's performing, and they're happy with what it's doing. And as I understand it, it is an internal repository. They don't put things in, or it's just kind of sitting doing what it needs to do. They also have a Hyrax 2.x repo with Fedora 4.7.5 underneath, and this one they would like to upgrade in the future. So they would love to upgrade their Hyrax instance, move off of active Fedora, but this is what's still kind of in the pipeline for them. But if anybody does have any, detailed specific questions about this particular migration and the work that Berlin State Library has done, Oliver is absolutely more than willing to talk about that or answer questions for people. Just send me a message and I can connect you. At the end of the slide, I also included a resource of Oliver talking about the migration at one of the Fedora user group meetings that was held back in 2020. But again, he's always more than willing to answer questions. So. And the last thing kind of I wanted to share here was just kind of, people always like to know what's happening, who's doing what, and, that's how people take their cues about what paths forward look like. So these are this is the current list of institutions that we know of who either have or are in the process of migrating to Fedora 6. So my pitch again, we're always looking to gather more information on people who are working with migrations or considering migrations so that we can better understand your process, what is working for you, what isn't working for you, so that we know how to help. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying to support migration. So if you are considering it, please reach out to us, and I would love to kind of hear what you're doing and see if we can connect you with somebody who might be able to either act as a mentor or answer any questions that you've got. So that is my list of resources. It does look extensive. If you need the tooling specifically, it's back. I will make sure the slide deck is available for everybody. It's back on the tools slide. But there's all the migration pathways that you need that I talked about, all the documentation that goes along with it, the video of Oliver Schoner at Berlin State Library talking about their migration, and then of course our communication channels. So please feel free to find us on Slack, find me on Slack, send me an email, whatever we can do to support going forward. And that is all I have. So thank you.